The world greeted you not with a gentle coo, but with a full-throated roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the longhouse. You arrived in a tempest of flailing limbs and crimson-faced fury, your lungs already seasoned for a lifetime of war cries. The midwife, a woman who had seen more than her share of Viking births, declared your inaugural howl a village record, a 7-minute epic of raw, untamed life. Even the village priest, a man accustomed to the boisterous nature of his flock, found himself on the receiving end of your burgeoning defiance, his finger twice mistaken for a pacifier. From the very beginning, it was clear you were not cast from the same mold as the other infants. While they gurgled, you growled. While they slumbered, you waged a silent war with the thatched roof, your gaze intense and unwavering. The family goat, a creature not easily perturbed, developed a sudden aversion to the longhouse, its bleating protests a testament to the sheer power of your infant rage. By the time you were mobile, your reign of terror had officially begun. No hearthstone was safe from your headbutts, no sheep immune to your inquisitive bites, and even your own shadow was not spared your wrath. Your parents, a mixture of alarm and a strange, burgeoning pride, watched as their bear cub, as your mother affectionately called you, carved a path of delightful destruction through their lives. Your father, ever the optimist, assured the neighbors you would outgrow this phase, a statement often punctuated by the wince of a freshly bandaged shin. While other children were content with carved wooden animals, you saw only weapons and their splintered remains. The trees in the nearby woods became the unwilling audience for your daily screaming practice, and a particularly stubborn rock was once challenged to a duel. You lost, but only because your cousin, in a desperate act of intervention, tackled you mid-roar, a feat that required a wooden spoon for his safe removal. As you grew, so did your legend. The village elders, their faces a mixture of amusement and concern, whispered of your spirited nature, a polite euphemism for what some were already calling a curse. The mead barrel, a sacred vessel of communal celebration, was declared off limits after you, in a fit of either accidental or intentional fury, liberated its handle. At the tender age of 4, the village shaman, a man who saw the world in shades of fire and ice, declared you had the fire in your blood, your grandmother, a woman of more practical inclinations, dismissed it as a simple case of worms. Regardless of the diagnosis, the prognosis was clear. Your path was one of yelling, battle, and a rather impressive collection of scars. And yet, in your own unique way, you were happy. A smile was a rare visitor to your face, but the raw, untamed laughter that erupted from your chest during a thunderstorm was a sight to behold. You began to carry a stick. Your first and most loyal companion, which you christened the enemy. Your one-sided conversations with it were a source of endless amusement for the villagers, a silent testament to the warrior spirit that already resided within you. In a land of stoic fishermen and quiet survivalists, you were a whirlwind of unpredictable fury, a small, shirtless force of nature. You were not destined for the quiet life of a farmer, nor the peaceful existence of a craftsman. You were built for something more, something wilder. You were built for berserking, and the entire village, with a mixture of trepidation and awe, knew it. Your childhood, if it could even be called that, was less about the innocent discovery of the world and more about the collateral damage left in your wake. While other Viking children were diligently mastering the practical skills essential for survival, the intricate knots of rope, the delicate art of fire building, the crucial understanding of not stepping on livestock, you, on the other hand, were specializing in a unique brand of accidental chaos. Your first wooden sword, a gift meant to inspire martial prowess, met its untimely end within an hour of its reception. Not through rigorous training, mind you, but by being swung with unbridled enthusiasm into a support beam during breakfast. The entire longhouse wobbled, a testament to your burgeoning strength, and your father, a man of few words and much patience, could only sigh. The chicken pen, a place of supposed tranquility, became a recurring battleground. Your initial curiosity quickly morphed into an attempt to train the feathered inhabitants, which inevitably escalated into a challenge to single combat with the formidable rooster. The rooster, a seasoned veteran of countless skirmishes, emerged victorious. Undeterred, you declared a rematch, and what transpired next remains a mystery. All that is known is that you thereafter sported a single triumphant feather braided into your hair, a silent declaration of victory. At the tender age of 6, you fashioned your own shield from the splintered remains of a broken barrel lit, a crude but effective piece of armor. With this newfound protection, you launched a full-scale charge into the family's drying racks. Clothes, freshly laundered and meticulously hung, scattered like leaves in a gale. Your mother, witnessing the domestic whirlwind, declared you a storm in human form, while your grandmother, ever the mystic, insisted you were possessed by a warrior spirit. Your own explanation was far simpler. You merely wished to see what would break first, you or the pole. It was, of course, the pole. You were not malicious, merely energetic. Your intentions were never cruel, just loud and fast. If something stood, you pushed it. If something clucked, you hit it. If something moved, you chased it. The village, a resilient community, quickly learned to adapt to your unique brand of existence. Neighbors began reinforcing their fences, local boys learned to play further from your house, and girls, with a mixture of fear and fascination, whispered your name. One particularly brave child, emboldened by youthful audacity, dared to call you goat-brained. You responded by tackling him into a snowdrift, a swift and decisive action that earned you a new nickname, Snowbreaker. You wore it with pride, a badge of honor in your chaotic world. Your only true friend, a sheepdog named Thoric, followed you everywhere, a loyal companion who occasionally intervened to save you from your own impulsive decisions. Like the time you attempted to scale the fish-drying scaffolds, a daring feat of self-training that ended with you falling, the fish surprisingly broke your fall, leaving you with a lingering scent of haddock that reappeared with every rainstorm. Occasionally, an elder, perhaps in a moment of desperate hope, would suggest sending you to the temple for spiritual guidance. The temple, having heard tales of your exploits, politely declined. And so you remained a child of noise and splinters, perpetually half covered in mud and stories. No one dared to teach you restraint, for even at the tender age of 7, it was abundantly clear that you were not destined to become a Viking farmer. You were destined to become a Viking problem. By the time you turned 8, the village had ceased to ask, "What's wrong with him?" and had instead begun to ponder, "How do we point him at our enemies?" There was an undeniable intensity in the way you glared at thunderstorms, as if challenging the very sky to a staring contest, a silent defiance that spoke volumes. Your movements were not mere runs, they were charges, through puddles, through fences, through anything that dared to stand in your path. Your appetite, a force of nature in itself, had become the stuff of legend. You ate as if preparing for the harshest winter, even in the height of summer. At one memorable feast, you inadvertently consumed 3 boiled eggs, 2 fish cakes, and a significant portion of a table centerpiece before anyone noticed. By then, you were already gnawing on a ladle, a testament to your insatiable hunger. Your body, a living tapestry of bruises and splinters, seemed impervious to pain, each mark a silent badge of honor that never slowed your relentless pace. The local healer, a man who had long since given up trying to mend your endless array of injuries, now simply offered a reassuring pat on the back and a weary, "Try to aim for the soft parts next time." You had begun to develop a laugh, not a sound of pure joy, but a deep, full-chested rumble that conveyed a sense of self-amusement, a realization that you had just scared yourself and rather enjoyed it. This particular laugh once erupted after a spectacular fall from a roof, an incident that resulted in a broken barrel, a crate of onions, and a fractured arm. You, however, insisted it was the best day of your life. You started carrying sticks, not twigs, but substantial branches the size of small trees, which you proudly christened battle staves. They bore names like Skull Tickler and Stick of Pain, and with them you dueled trees, some of which, to their misfortune, lost. Your parents, resigned to your untamed nature, abandoned all attempts at assigning chores. Every endeavor to instill patience in you inevitably ended in something catching fire. Once it was a bench, another time your own tunic, a style you wisely chose not to wear again. The village elders, Their voices, now hushed with a mixture of awe and concern, began to speak of you. They whispered that you might be Berserker born, touched by Odin himself, or perhaps simply cursed by an overabundance of goat milk. Regardless of the divine or mundane explanation, it was clear you were no longer just a rambunctious child. You were something more, something untrainable, unshakable, a force that sent wolves scattering and birds fleeing at your approach. You were becoming the very embodiment of the warnings Norse mothers whispered to their children, and your journey had barely even begun. At the age of 10, a decision was finally made. You would receive formal training. The identity of the individual who made this brave, or perhaps foolish decree remained unclear, as no one, understandably, volunteered to be your trainer. Eventually, a one-eyed veteran named Gore the Limp, a man whose motivations were a blend of boredom and possibly a long-held desire for revenge, stepped forward. Gore's pedagogical approach was unconventional, to say the least. He would stand 20 feet away, shouting commands like, "Swing harder, less teeth, more axe," while you flailed wildly at straw dummies, tree trunks, and the occasional chicken that dared to wander too close. He offered no corrections to your form, primarily because you possessed none. What you did possess was an unstoppable momentum and the blind confidence of a boy who had once attempted to arm wrestle a weathered oak. Your weapon options were limited. You were handed a practice axe so dull it could legally be classified as a spoon. You sharpened it against a rock, and the rock, to its dismay, lost. The next day, Gore presented you with a heavier one. Your gratitude was expressed by swinging it mid-conversation, sending his drinking horn tumbling into a nearby fire. He merely nodded a silent acknowledgement that you were destined for greatness. While other children trained with discipline and precision, you trained by charging at hay bales and screaming at birds. You weren't so much learning swordplay as developing a deeply personal relationship with chaos. You were also introduced to wrestling, a Norse staple. Your first match ended with you suplexing a boy named Egil into a puddle with such force that he developed a permanent stutter. The considerate warrior, helped him up afterward and, with genuine curiosity, asked if he wished to be friends. He politely declined and promptly relocated to another village. There was no written curriculum for your training, but it was evident you were being groomed for something extraordinary. People began to refer to you not as a boy, but as the project. Gore, a man not easily impressed, remarked that he hadn't witnessed such raw, unfocused rage since the time he headbutted a monk during a raid, and the monk, to his eternal chagrin, won. The only structured lesson you genuinely enjoyed was battle chants, not for their rhythmic cadence, but because shouting in unison with other boys provided a socially acceptable outlet for your innate need to yell without being banished outdoors. You never mastered footwork, timing, or balance. What you mastered was unpredictability, a quality so potent that even seasoned warriors instinctively stepped aside when they saw you charging. Your training, while unorthodox, was undeniably effective, and the next step on your path was the fur frenzy and the full-on berserking. By the age of 12, your reputation had swelled to proportions far exceeding your physical stature. Across 3 villages, you were known simply as that loud boy who headbutts things, and one particularly disgruntled farmer swore you had single-handedly driven his scarecrow into early retirement. The time had come for a pivotal rite of passage, the bearskin ceremony, your official induction into the revered and somewhat feared Berserker fold. No one bothered to explain the intricacies of the ceremony beforehand. One crisp morning, Gore the Limp, with a characteristic grunt, simply handed you a bucket filled with goat's blood and a terse, "You'll need this." This pronouncement, far from calming you, ignited a spark of wild excitement, a mildly unhinged, foaming at the mouth sort of anticipation. You were led deep into the ancient, whispering forest, where 5 imposing figures stood in a silent circle around a crackling fire. Each bore the marks of a seasoned warrior, shirtless, scarred, or muttering to themselves. One, a formidable specimen, embodied all 3. They acknowledged your presence with that quintessential Viking nod, devoid of overt emotion yet undeniably menacing. The initial phase of the ceremony involved the painting of runes upon your chest with the goat's blood. The symbols, ancient and potent, likely invoke courage, strength, or perhaps a silent plea of, please don't bite me. You, with an uncharacteristic display of self-control, refrained from asking questions, uh, and with even greater effort, managed not to sneeze. Then came the bear skin. It was colossal, emanating an odor that suggested it had fought its own funeral and was draped over your shoulders like a heavy, hairy prophecy. Whether the bear had met its end in honorable combat or simply succumbed to the sheer force of your scent remained a mystery. Regardless, it fit. As the fire danced and crackled and the elder berserkers chanted in deep guttural tones, a language that was probably Norse, but could just as easily have been primal grunting, you were handed a horn filled with a liquid that was vaguely alcoholic, undeniably spicy, and absolutely suspicious. You drained it in a single audacious gulp. This, you quickly realized, was a mistake. Your eyebrows, in a brief but dramatic rebellion, attempted to escape your face. Now you danced. Not with grace, not with skill, but with a violent, untamed energy like a thunderstorm in the throes of a tantrum. You stomped, you howled, you flailed your arms as if pursued by an invisible swarm of bees. This was the process of becoming the bear. You were encouraged not to fall into the fire, though notably you were not explicitly forbidden from doing so. When the ceremony concluded, you were bestowed with your new name. It might have been Wolf Liver, or Ulfa's Scream, or perhaps something else entirely. You were too disoriented to hear clearly. But it didn't matter. You were now officially a berserker in training. Your enemies, wherever they might be, had ample reason to begin worrying, for you had been given the fur, and now you were learning to growl. Now that you were a junior berserker adorned with a bearskin that smelled of wet thunder, it was time to delve into one of the oldest and most sacred tenets of berserker culture, the pre-battle rituals. These, you quickly discovered, predominantly involved mushrooms, not the culinary variety destined for stew, but the kind consumed when one desired to question the very fabric of reality and roar defiance at passing clouds. No one offered a detailed explanation of the fungi's effects. They simply pressed a fistful into your hand and instructed, chew fast. You complied with alacrity. The taste was a peculiar blend of moss, goat, sweat, and a hint of something akin to shame. Within minutes, your vision began to undulate, and the fire, with an unsettling sentience, started to speak in riddles. A burp from a nearby comrade resonated in your ears like a distant war horn. You were ready. You were then introduced to what the elders termed the berserker trance, the ultimate goal of which was to unleash your inner beast. Yours, it appeared, was a confused elk with a severe case of boundary issues. You, however, were beyond such trivial concerns. A wide, feral grin stretched across your face, accompanied by a low, continuous growl. Your muscles felt as if they were engorged with molten iron and reckless decisions. A training dummy was produced. You, disdaining instruction, charged, tackled it, and with primal instinct bit its neck. The elders, surprisingly, were impressed. The dummy, less so. One of the older berserkers, with a nod of approval, simply stated, "Yep, he's got it." The mushrooms, however, came with their own set of peculiar side effects. Time itself seemed to warp and bend. You were unsure if you had been screaming for 10 seconds or 3 hours. You attempted to punch a shadow. It, with surprising agility, ducked. You accused the very ground beneath your feet of betrayal. Eventually, you succumbed to exhaustion mid-sprint, collapsing face first into a barrel of fish. The fish miraculously remained unharmed. You, however, carried the scent of sadness and seawater for a week. Despite these minor inconveniences, the ritual was deemed a resounding success. Not all berserkers relied on the hallucinogenic path. Some achieved their trance through fasting, others through intense meditation, and still others through sheer, unadulterated rage and unresolved trauma. You, however, seemed to thrive on the mushroom-induced option, which you affectionately termed brain lightning. No one dared to correct you. The objective was simple: to transcend the human, to become something more than man, something akin to a storm, a force capable of terrifying enemies before your axe even made contact. A warrior who did not retreat, not out of courage, but because in the throes of frenzy you had forgotten how directions worked. And that precisely was what made you special, dangerous, and frankly rather difficult to babysit. You were no longer merely learning to fight, you were learning how to unleash the storm within. Finally, the moment arrived. No more tedious practice, no more flailing at straw dummies, no more politely gnawing on logs. You were on the precipice of your first true battle, and with it the unleashing of your first full-blown berserk gang, the technical term as you understood it for complete glorious, screaming madness. You awoke on battle day with a singular crystal clear thought. Violence today sounded exceptionally good. Breakfast was a non-event, not due to any adherence to fasting rituals, but because your excitement had inadvertently reduced your meal to a pulpy mess. You did, however, readily accept the ritual mushroom snack, your stomach by this point having reclassified it as a fundamental food group. Then came the pre-battle dance, a spectacle that bore little resemblance to any conventional dance form. It was, in essence, a collective shouting session punctuated by enthusiastic hopping. You swung your axe with wild abandon until a comrade with a well-timed reminder pointed out that your allies were not, in fact, the enemy. You grunted a mumbled apology and, as a sign of progress, headbutted a helmet instead. As the enemy forces drew near, the world began to narrow, tunneling into a singular, all-consuming focus. You were vaguely aware of screaming, a primal sound that might have been your own. Your grip on your axe tightened until the wood groaned in protest. Your eyes, in a subtle but alarming shift, rolled back just enough to cause concern among your comrades, but to elicit a knowing whisper of, "He's ready," from Gore. And then the frenzy. You didn't walk, you didn't jog, you charged. Your legs, abandoning all pretense of coordination, propelled you forward on pure instinct. You leaped, you roared, you flailed, and swung with the improbable grace of a walrus engulfed in flames, yet with the devastating efficiency of a tornado nursing a grudge. Pain became an irrelevant concept. An arrow grazed your side, and your response was to bite a nearby tree. A spear narrowly missed its mark, and you retaliated by delivering a high kick to its owner's knee, continuing your relentless advance. You tackled two men and didn't stop until their identities had completely faded from your memory. You were every Viking's nightmare made manifest. This was the Berserk Gang, a state where the body operated solely on a potent cocktail of rage, adrenaline, and an almost complete absence of impulse control. Some called it divine possession, others psychological dissociation. You, however, simply called it Tuesday. You screamed until your throat was raw. You fought until your arms went numb. You were unreachable, a force of nature that even your own comrades dared not approach. One, in a moment of cautious bravery, gently patted your back with his shield, a silent signal that the battle was concluded. Your response was to hurl a log at him, an act he remarkably interpreted as a compliment. When the dust settled and the cacophony of battle subsided, you stood amidst the carnage, barely covered in blood, bruises, and fragments of someone's helmet. No one spoke. They simply stared. You blinked twice and, with a satisfied sigh, muttered, "Good warm-up." You were officially a berserker. You may have noticed something rather peculiar during your initial forays into battle, a distinct and rather alarming absence of anything remotely resembling armor. While your fellow warriors meticulously donned mail, helmets, and strategically placed pieces of boiled leather, you, with an almost defiant disregard for self-preservation, strode onto the battlefield clad only in fur, spit, and an unshakable optimism. If you were feeling particularly extravagant, perhaps the leather strap around your wrist, more for fashion than for any practical protection. Berserkers, you see, do not wear armor. And why, you might ask? Because armor is for those who anticipate being struck. Your strategy, a masterpiece of psychological warfare, revolved around terrifying your adversaries into a hasty retreat or screaming themselves into submission. Should an enemy, by some improbable stroke of misfortune, manage to land a blow, it was not merely a physical impact. It was a profound personal failure um, a transgression that would be remembered forever and brought up with passive-aggressive regularity at every subsequent feast. There was also the crucial matter of freedom of movement. Armor, in its very essence, is heavy. It clings, it restricts, it impedes the wild, uninhibited flailing that constituted approximately 80% of Berserker combat. The remaining 20% was a delicate balance of 10% biting and 10% rolling through burning bushes. Such intricate maneuvers were simply impossible while encased in a helmet. Your bearskin cloak, however, was a different matter entirely. It was sacred. It reeked of burnt ham and regret, but it held a profound significance. Some whispered of its magical properties, claiming it could absorb enemy fear or even deflect steel. In truth, it primarily absorbed rain and rendered you the appearance of a very angry, somewhat damp rug. But that precisely was the point. You were not meant to appear human. You were meant to embody something that had escaped the pages of a saga and now haunted the coastline, a living, breathing nightmare. The absence of armor also meant that your very body became your shield. Calluses formed where others built layers of steel. Your scars, each a testament to a past encounter, formed intricate constellations upon your skin. And if you were truly committed to the berserker aesthetic, you might even tattoo a wolf upon your chest, a permanent declaration etched with ash, a sharp stick, and a healthy dose of poor decision-making. Of course, there were moments of pain. Arrows stung, blades left their indelible marks. But to a berserker, pain was merely a helpful reminder that you had not yet succumbed. You once sustained a stab wound to the leg and remained blissfully unaware until a comrade, with a hint of alarm, pointed out that you were in fact leaking. You thanked him and then, with a characteristic flourish, hurled a rock at the individual responsible for your minor inconvenience. Other warriors, accustomed to the conventional methods of warfare, might scoff at your apparent lack of defense. That is, until they witnessed you single-handedly dispatching 3 men with nothing more than a wooden spoon and a primal scream. At that point, their scoffing tended to originate from a considerably safer distance, because armor, you understood, was vastly overrated. You possessed something far more potent, an unyielding rage, a protective fur, and an absolute unwavering disregard for consequences. Here's a little-known truth about the berserker state. Once the blood haze descends, every living thing, friend or foe, begins to resemble an enemy. You might enter battle with the purest intentions, perhaps even a silent vow to only maim the correct individuals. But then the screaming starts. The mushrooms by now have fully asserted their influence, and suddenly your own warband begins to look suspiciously, tantalizingly stab-worthy. Your first incident was relatively minor. In a moment of misguided enthusiasm, you headbutted your shield brother while attempting to high-five him with your axe. He, a man of remarkable composure, took it in stride, grunting, part of the experience, as he applied moss to the fresh wound. But the incidents escalated with alarming rapidity. In your third raid, you mistook a fellow Viking's meticulously braided beard for a venomous snake and, with admirable conviction, attempted to punch it clean off his face. Later, amidst the swirling chaos of a melee, you hurled your helmet at someone who was, in fact, shouting your name. It was your cousin, attempting to inform you that dinner was ready. Yet, remarkably, no one held a grudge. Because you were a berserker, and berserkers, it was understood, were akin to extremely violent puppies, messy, unpredictable, and utterly oblivious to the force of their own bites. You even, on one memorable occasion, managed to apologize mid-frenzy after slamming into someone's back. The apology emerged as a guttural roar, accompanied by a vigorous thumbs up. The recipient, from his prone position on the ground, nodded respectfully. The warband, in a testament to their adaptability, began to develop intricate tactics to ensure their survival in your immediate vicinity. Some took to wearing bright red sashes, a visual cue meant to remind you not to tackle them. You, with characteristic forgetfulness, tackled them anyway. Others maintained a safe 10-foot distance, allowing you to clear a path of unsuspecting enemies. One particularly clever warrior discovered that shouting your name mid-fight would effectively confuse you, sending you off in pursuit of an imaginary foe. It worked. You once chased a tree for 20 minutes, convinced it was a particularly insolent opponent. Occasionally, someone would tentatively suggest attaching a bell around your neck. Their suggestions were, predictably, ignored. You were not a goat. You merely acted like one. By now, your comrades had refined their system. If you charged in the wrong direction, they simply waited. If you roared at a tent, they knew to grant you 5 minutes of unbridled fury before quietly setting it on fire afterward, ensuring you felt a sense of accomplishment. Despite the occasional accidental injury, no one wanted to fight without you. Because while you might swing wildly, inadvertently strike allies, and nip at a few ankles, you also possess the unique ability to shatter enemy morale simply by existing. You were a storm, and sometimes storms, in their indiscriminate fury, struck friendly boats, but they were still storms. By now your name carried weight, not respect in the traditional sense, but more a pervasive sense of unease in neighboring villages. You were known as that one with the twitch, or the boy who ate a shield. No one was entirely certain if the latter tale was true, but you, with a shrewd understanding of your burgeoning legend, never bothered to correct them. In the Berserker business, myth, you understood, was far more potent than mere memory. Word of your approach spread faster than you could travel. Before you even arrived, villagers would hide their goats and reinforce their fences. Children whispered your name during thunderstorms, and some adults, particularly those who still recalled the time you mistook a feast for a fight and overturned 3 tables before someone wisely handed you a leg of lamb and gently redirected you towards the food, did the same. In battle, enemies hesitated at the sight of you, not because you were tall or adorned in finery. You were not. You were usually barefoot, shirtless, and bleeding from somewhere, but because your eyes conveyed a chilling message. I don't know who you are, and I don't care. I just need something to scream at. This psychological warfare was your greatest weapon. You possessed no polished armor, no refined technique. You had reputation, and that, you knew, was far more terrifying. But reputation, you quickly learned, came with a price: damage control. After every battle, the arduous process of cleanup began. You typically awoke with a throbbing headache, covered in someone else's blood, clutching a tree branch you had in a moment of post-frenzy clarity named victory. A priest, in a brave but ultimately futile gesture, would offer a prayer. You would grunt in response, and he would wisely retreat. You had inadvertently broken 3 longships twice by simply stepping on them. You had scared off a diplomat by growling during a council meeting, and once you had attempted to wrestle a statue. You lost, but only technically. Your warband, ever resourceful, learned to assign a handler, someone whose sole purpose was to calm you post-battle, guide you away from anything flammable, and gently remind you that tents were not, in fact, enemies. You would nod then, with an ingrained reflex, punch the ground, old habits dying hard. Despite these minor inconveniences, your legend continued to grow. Skalds, the Norse poets, composed songs about you, mostly in minor keys. One, a particular favorite, referred to you as the howling hammer of Nordfield. You liked it, though you had no recollection of Nordfield, assuming it was merely something you had at some point. Broken, you were no longer just a warrior. You were a walking rumor, a moving cautionary tale with shoulders of immense strength and absolutely no impulse control. And in this brutal world of axes and honor, that made you invaluable, or at the very least, endlessly entertaining. You never truly planned on falling in love. Most berserkers in their chaotic existence didn't. Feelings were, after all, tricky, elusive things, difficult to swing an axe at, and generally uncooperative with the berserker temperament. But then, one day, amidst the relentless rhythm of raids and headbutts, it happened. She was the blacksmith's daughter, A woman forged of strong forearms, eyes that held a suspicious glint, and a remarkable tendency to wield tongs with decisive accuracy when annoyed. You found this surprisingly attractive. She, in turn, found you interesting, a term that, while generous, was a polite euphemism for dangerous but occasionally amusing. Your courtship, as was fitting for a Viking, began in the most traditional way by accidentally breaking her father's anvil. You, in a moment of scientific curiosity, had attempted to test its strength by striking it with a log. She stormed out, a whirlwind of fury, only to pause mid-tirade when you, with absolute and unshakable sincerity, offered to fight the anvil's ghost. A small laugh escaped her, followed by a well-aimed horseshoe. Love, you realized, was a peculiar thing. You attempted to impress her with your formidable skills. You flexed. You hurled a rock an impressive distance. You even lifted a goat. She watched politely, her hammer never ceasing its rhythmic dance against hot metal. Eventually, she agreed to go for a walk. Primarily, you suspected, because it was safer to supervise you than to leave you unattended. Conversation was predictably awkward. You possessed no innate talent for flirtation, but you were exceptionally skilled at screaming and carrying heavy objects. So you carried a log for the entire duration of the walk. She remarkably made no comment. That you instinctively knew was how you recognized she might be the one. Your fellow berserkers, accustomed to your singular focus on destruction, were utterly bewildered. Isn't love a distraction? One ventured, his brow furrowed in confusion. You explained with a rare moment of clarity that she provided you with a reason not to destroy every tent you encountered. That, he muttered, a hint of suspicion in his voice, sounds suspiciously like discipline. You offered no response, already engrossed in the meticulous task of carving her name into your bare skin with a stick. Eventually, she presented you with a necklace, a simple piece of metal, slightly sharp. You never removed it, not even in battle, especially not in battle. When questioned about its significance, you would simply state, "It protects me," a statement that was both sweet and, given your usual demeanor, slightly alarming. You still didn't fully comprehend emotions, but you understood loyalty. She, in turn, fixed your gear. You brought her interesting bones. It was, in its own unconventional way, working. There were arguments, of course. You once attempted to serenade her by howling at the moon. She, with admirable restraint, asked you to cease. You, with characteristic defiance, howled louder. You spent 3 nights sleeping outside, a small price to pay for artistic expression. Yet she never left. And that, in berserker terms, was as close to a marriage proposal as you were likely to get. You may have been a force of chaos, but even storms, you discovered, occasionally enjoyed a little lightning romance. After the brutal symphony of battle came the raucous celebration of the feast, the Viking reward system for the simple act of not dying. For most warriors, it was a time of joyous revelry filled with food, drink, song, and the competitive art of belching. For you, however, it was a treacherous minefield fraught with the perils of too much unspent energy and a distinct lack of self-control. You invariably arrived late, a necessity born from the requirement that someone first scrape the congealed blood from your person. You would enter shirtless, bruised, perhaps missing a sandal, and invariably clutching something that may or may not have been edible. On one memorable occasion, you presented a squirrel. No one, to your mild confusion, ate it, yet it continued to feature prominently in the Skald songs, a testament to your unique contributions to the communal table. The feast commenced with a toast, a signal which you, with characteristic enthusiasm, interpreted as an open invitation to consume everything within arm's reach. Mead, ale, and something that smelled suspiciously like fermented regret flowed freely. You once by accident drank lamp oil. No one, surprisingly, intervened. That night you lit a torch with your breath, a feat that children still recounted with wide-eyed wonder. Then came the food, mountains of bread, roasted meats, and pickled everything. You approached the table as if it owed you money, your eating style less about chewing and more about a forceful negotiation with your meal, using your entire face as a bargaining tool. You once devoured 5 boiled eggs in a single minute, a personal best, and then, in a fit of post-gorging delirium, declared war on a cabbage. Your digestive system, however, had not yet caught up to your boundless ambitions. This disparity led to the infamous Great Hall Incident, a night marked by an abundance of beans, raucous singing, and a strategically timed battle chant that culminated in a sound that echoed off the stone walls of the hall. You, with a practiced nonchalance, pretended nothing had happened. Everyone else, with equal conviction, pretended not to have heard it. One man, in a moment of profound despair, wept softly into his porridge. And then, inevitably, came the fighting. For, of course, a room filled with sleep-deprived warriors, armed with weapons and copious amounts of mead, was the perfect crucible for emotional growth. You once instigated a brawl by mishearing someone say, "Pass the boar," interpreting it as, "You smell like boar." You took it personally. The benches, alas, never recovered. Despite the chaos you invariably unleashed, you were always inexplicably forgiven. Why? Because you entertained. You fought with a raw, untamed passion. You ate with an almost religious conviction, and your flatulence on one notable occasion had successfully scared a wolf away from the village. Such contributions, it was understood, were invaluable. By the end of the night, you would invariably be found asleep under a table, clutching a ham bone and humming a war song to yourself. Because berserkers, it was clear, didn't just rage in battle, they partied like the apocalypse was nigh. Every truly great berserker possesses one tale they rarely, if ever, speak of. Yours was known simply and ominously as the sheep incident. It commenced, as most raids did, with the familiar rhythm of a longship cutting through the waves, the distant scent of a coastal village, and the intoxicating aroma of overconfidence. You were, to put it mildly, pumped. The ritual mushrooms had been consumed, and your battle bear skin, worn backwards for maximum intimidation, billowed in the wind. No one wisely dared to correct your sartorial choice. No one, it seemed, wished to die that day. The plan, as articulated by the chieftain, was straightforward: raid a small settlement, acquire some silver, and for good measure, break a few fences. Upon arrival, the village presented an unsettling tableau. It was empty, suspiciously empty. No guards, no screams, just an abundance of sheep. Most warriors, confronted with such an anomaly, would have paused, perhaps even exercised a modicum of caution. You, however, charged. You leaped from the longship, a primal howl tearing from your throat, and sprinted directly into the nearest woolly blur. It was indeed a sheep. It offered no resistance. You, interpreting this as an act of submission, declared victory. The others, driven more by confusion than conviction, followed your lead. You then proceeded to attack structures with unrestrained enthusiasm. One of these structures, to your mild surprise, turned out to be a chicken coop. You were, in turn, aggressively pecked by 5 indignant hens and a rooster named Olaf. Your retaliation involved headbutting the sky, a gesture of defiance whose ultimate victor remained unclear. Eventually, you stumbled into what appeared to be a sacred hut, and with a sweeping gesture overturned an altar. It was, as it transpired, someone's kitchen. You consumed 2 loaves of bread and a candle. The realization that it was, in fact, a candle dawned upon you only when it began to burn your throat. You growled. The candle, you were certain, regretted everything. It became painfully obvious that this was not a village, but merely someone's summer pasture. A farmer, elderly and alone, appeared on the horizon, armed with a rake and a look of mild irritation. You screamed. He squinted. You charged. He threw a turnip at your head. You, in a rare display of tactical retreat, withdrew. This, it was decided, marked the official end of the raid. Back at camp, a heavy silence hung in the air. One warrior, in a soft, almost mournful tone, muttered, "We stole a goat." You nodded solemnly. Another added, "And we burned a cabbage patch." You, ever the pragmatist, responded, "It looked threatening." The Scalds, in a valiant but ultimately futile attempt, Tried to spin the incident into a tale of courage. They failed. You were and forever would be remembered as the berserker who conquered a flock and lost to root vegetables. You attempted to defend your actions. The sheep, you insisted, were looking at me funny. They nodded. They had heard worse. And yet, despite this ignominious defeat, your legend continued to grow. Because sometimes what makes a berserker truly memorable isn't just victory, it's volume. You are older now, not wise perhaps, but possessed of that particular kind of seniority where your knees crack with every crouch and people no longer flinch when you raise your axe, for they know it takes a full minute to complete its arc. Your beard, once a fiery testament to your youth, is now streaked with gray, and your scars, each a story etched into your flesh, have begun to double as weather predictors. You have surprisingly achieved something few berserkers ever do: survival. Most of your kind, consumed by their own unbridled fury, burn out early, victims of too much rage, too many mushrooms, and a distinct lack of strategic ducking. But you have dodged death by sheer glorious unpredictability. Even the gods, it seems, are unsure of your next move. Your name, once whispered with trepidation, is now spoken with a grudging respect, or at the very least with considerable volume. Some say you are a creature of myth, half bear, half wolf, half madman. No one thankfully bothers with the arithmetic, they simply nod in agreement. You have in your later years even attempted to train a few young warriors, endeavoring to pass on the arcane craft of the berserker. You taught one how to roar from the very depths of his stomach. Another, you instructed in the art of tackling a tree without the slightest hint of apology. You even imparted to a third the crucial skill of screaming, "I am the wind," mid-fight. He, to your mild amusement, now runs a bakery, but still on occasion unleashes the battle cry during dough kneading. You no longer participate in raids with the same frequency. Your last attempt, a rather ignominious affair, ended with you becoming inextricably stuck in a doorway, a predicament you, with characteristic deflection, blamed on the architecture. Instead, you have assumed the role of village guardian, a formidable presence who stands by fires grumbling like a particularly irritable mountain. Occasionally, someone with a hopeful glint in their eye will offer you a mushroom. You will sniff it, a faint flicker of recognition in your eyes, and then, with a dismissive wave, mutter, "Not today," hallucinations. Your companion, the blacksmith's daughter, still endures your eccentricities with remarkable patience. She rolls her eyes when you growl at thunder. You, in turn, roll yours when she suggests you wash your cloak. Neither of you, it seems, ever truly listens to the other, and that, you have come to understand, is love. And so, your legacy, once defined solely by war, has expanded to encompass something more profound: presence. Children, mimicking your youthful antics, play berserker by throwing sticks and yelling. Elders, witnessing a particularly boisterous display, will often mutter, "You remind me of him," whenever someone inadvertently kicks over a bench. Your legend is no longer merely about chaos. It is about survival, about laughter, and, it must be admitted, about very poor table manners. You may not live forever, but your stories, loud, inaccurate, and almost certainly involving sheep, will echo through the ages. For no one, not even you, the roaring, flailing, mushroom-fueled nightmare of the North, lives forever. One harsh winter, the relentless cold began to wage a silent war against your very bones. Your grunts, once expressions of defiance, now outnumbered your words. The fire, once a mere source of warmth, transformed into your most cherished weapon, as flickering flames a constant companion. You would sit beside it muttering to yourself, polishing your axe with a stray bit of beard you had, in a moment of accidental sneezing, torn out. You did not fear death. You had, after all, shouted at it too many times to count. You once, in a fit of audacious bravado, attempted to wrestle a thunderstorm purely to inspire envy in the afterlife. If anything, you were annoyed by its tardiness, often remarking, "Any day now," followed by a dramatic cough and the theatrical chewing of rocks for added effect. Eventually it came, not in the glorious chaos of battle, nor amidst the clamor of a raid, but peacefully, under the vast star-studded canvas of the night sky. You were wrapped in your old bear skin, which even in death retained its characteristic scent of regret and goat. You simply leaned back, exhaled a final, contented sigh, and muttered, "Tell Valhalla to reinforce the chairs." They say the skies thundered that night, a deep, resonant rumble that echoed your passing. They say a wolf, somewhere in the silent woods, howled without reason its mournful cry, a lament for a kindred spirit. They say someone, in the quiet aftermath, discovered your final words etched into a shield, "I regret nothing, except that turnip." Your funeral, as was to be expected, was a glorious, chaotic mess. The village, in a valiant but ultimately futile attempt, tried to orchestrate a dignified ceremony. Instead, half the mourners, fueled by grief and mead, devolved into a brawl after someone, with ill-timed honesty, mentioned your legendary feat of punching a cloud. A goat, seizing the opportunity, escaped its confines. The pyre, in a burst of premature enthusiasm, caught fire too early. You, undoubtedly, would have been immensely proud. Your war band, a motley collection of loyal comrades, drank heavily, their voices raised in off-key songs. They tossed your old helmet into the fjord, where it promptly sank, just as you once did, drunk during a swimming contest with a barrel. Children with sticks and guttural grunts reenacted your life, one even biting a log in a heartfelt tribute. Everyone agreed. Your spirit lived on. The skalds, ever the purveyors of embellished truth, composed ballads, none of which predictably were accurate. You were credited with slaying 20 men in a single swing and seducing a forest spirit. No one, of course, bothered to correct them. History, after all, prefers entertainment over truth. You were gone, yes, but never forgotten. For you were not merely a warrior, you were a walking storm in human form, an equal blend of chaos and comedy. And long after the fires of your pyre had dwindled to embers, your roar continued to echo through tales, through scars, and through the poorly reinforced walls of taverns across the land. When the image of a Viking springs to mind, it's often accompanied by a flurry of familiar cliches. Blood, soaked axes, snarling beards, and perhaps a rather generous amount of mead. But here lies a fascinating twist, a lesser-known truth that challenges these ingrained perceptions. Those battle-hardened Norsemen harbored a surprising, almost meticulous obsession with their personal appearance. Beneath the myths of savagery and unkempt wildness lay a culture that placed a remarkable value on grooming, cleanliness, and a meticulously put-together look. Indeed, your average Viking, far from being a grimy brute, might very well have been cleaner than you are on a leisurely Sunday. Archaeological excavations of Viking graves and settlements have yielded a treasure trove of unexpected artifacts. Alongside the expected swords and drinking horns, researchers have unearthed tweezers, razors, ear spoons, and perhaps most notably, an abundance of combs. And these were not crude utilitarian implements. Many were exquisitely carved from bone or antler, some even adorned with delicate inlays, transforming them into miniature works of art. These were not mere tooth scratches, they were status symbols, tucked into belts or secreted away in pouches, the Viking equivalent of a designer accessory. Their commitment to personal hygiene didn't stop at combs. Both men and women possessed comprehensive grooming kits, often stored with the same reverence and care as their weapons. This was no accident. To the Vikings, personal cleanliness transcended mere hygiene. It was intrinsically linked to honor. Looking sharp, being well-groomed, was a direct reflection of self-respect, and in a society where one's reputation was paramount, appearing disheveled at a feast or a thing, their version of a town hall meeting, was simply unthinkable. In fact, the line between fierce warrior and flamboyant peacock often blurred. Oiled beards, intricately braided hair, and tunics ablaze with vibrant colors were not mere side hobbies. They were powerful statements. A well-groomed man, fresh from a 3-day sea voyage and a few decapitations, could still proudly declare, "Look at this beard, pristine." Even individuals of lower status including slaves, had access to grooming tools. This was because, unlike some later medieval societies that equated filth with piety or humility, the Vikings viewed cleanliness not as sinful, but as undeniably appealing. If one wished to impress a potential bride or assert dominance in a courtly setting, the first step was always a clean face and neatly combed hair. First impressions, it was understood, held immense weight. Just ask any Viking woman. Most sagas in their descriptions of beauty emphasize bright eyes, shining hair, and spotless skin rather than the rugged allure of battle scars. So, no, the Vikings were not the dirty brutes of popular imagination. They were, in fact, high maintenance, fashion forward warriors who conquered not only with their blades but with their impeccable style. While much of medieval Europe was still embroiled in a heated debate about whether water was a tool of the devil or a potential source of disease, the Vikings were scrubbing themselves down with an enthusiasm that bordered on a national sport. Cleanliness for them was not an occasional indulgence. It was a deeply ingrained routine, so much so that they literally named a day after it, Lauger Dagger, or Bath Day, which, through the linguistic alchemy of time, eventually bequeathed us the word Saturday. Yes, your lazy Netflix and shower day has its roots in Viking culture. Now, bathing for the Vikings was not merely about washing off the grime of the battlefield or the lingering scent of fish. It was a multifaceted ritual, at once social, spiritual, and on occasion even romantic. Families would heat water over a crackling fire, pouring it into large wooden tubs. The wealthier echelons of society might even boast their own dedicated bathhouses, while the less affluent would make do with a nearby stream. Regardless of one's social standing, the expectation was clear: you were getting clean, no excuses, and what of soap? Oh, they had it. Crafted from a potent mixture of animal fat and ash, Viking soap was a formidable substance, gritty, alkaline, and shockingly effective. It may not have possessed the delicate lavender-scented allure of modern soaps, nor did it offer any gentle exfoliating properties, but it got the job done. Some formulations were even potent enough to bleach hair, a convenient side effect that many Viking men embraced with gusto. A blonde beard, it turned out, was not always a genetic blessing. It could also be a deliberate fashion choice. That's right. Ancient Norsemen were literally bleaching their beards centuries before punk rockers even considered it edgy. But here's where the story takes a truly amusing turn. Their enemies despised this about them. English monks and chroniclers in their written accounts simply could not fathom the Norsemen's obsession with cleanliness. They complained, with a mixture of bewilderment and disgust, that the Vikings washed their faces every day, combed their hair with infuriating regularity, and even, scandalously, changed their clothes. One particularly disgruntled 11th century chronicler went so far as to blame the Vikings' grooming habits for their remarkable success with Anglo-Saxon women. According to his lamentations, English women were utterly dazzled by the fresh and fashionable appearance of their invaders, a state of affairs that did not reflect well on the local men. And let's be clear, this meticulous approach to hygiene was not confined to men. Viking women were equally fastidious. Their beauty routines likely included the application of hair oils, skincare concoctions made from herbs or animal fats, and of course their own personal sets of grooming tools. Cleanliness was a communal affair. You bathed, you socialized, and perhaps in the process you caught the eye of that cute shield maiden across the steam. It was a world where hygiene and romance were not mutually exclusive, but rather intertwined in a dance of cleanliness and courtship. If your mental image of Viking clothing consists solely of ragged pelts held together by fish guts and questionable decisions, it's time for a radical reevaluation. The Vikings, far from being sartorial savages, possessed a keen sense of style driven not merely by function but by a genuine flair for fashion. These were not cave-dwelling primitives who simply threw on whatever unfortunate animal had expired closest to them. On the contrary, they meticulously crafted their outfits, incorporating vibrant colors, intricate embroidery, and crucially layers, many, many layers. Indeed, if you had dared to enter a Viking longhouse clad in drab beige, you might have been met with a concerned glance, perhaps even offered a comb, and a polite inquiry as to whether everything was all right at home. Let's begin with the foundational elements. Viking men typically wore a tunic fashioned from linen or wool that extended to their thighs, paired with trousers or leggings, but the ensemble didn't end there. Belts were not merely utilitarian devices for holding up one's garments. They were potent statements of wealth and status. A richly adorned belt buckle could, with its gleaming presence, proclaim one's importance as loudly as any battle axe. Cloaks were also a common sight, fastened with decorative brooches, often exquisitely shaped into animals, dragons, or symbols drawn from Norse mythology. Practical, certainly, but also an early form of Viking flexing. Now, the women, they were not, as some might imagine, simply wrapped in potato sacks. Viking women's fashion was equally distinctive and thoughtfully designed. They typically wore a long underdress overlaid with a shorter overdress secured at the shoulders by a pair of oval brooches. From these brooches, beaded strands would hang, adorned with glass, amber, or metal charms. This was a clever fusion of utility and adornment, a subtle yet powerful statement. If you wished to discern who truly ran the household, one needed only to observe the woman with the most jangly accessories. And color. Oh, how they reveled in color. Vikings meticulously dyed their clothing using natural pigments. Vibrant yellows extracted from birch leaves, deep reds from madder root, and rich blues from woad. While the most intense and luxurious hues were often reserved for the wealthy elite, even the average folk sported at least some splash of color. A pop of blue or red on your tunic might signify good taste, or simply that your wife had access to a particularly potent dye. Footwear typically consisted of leather shoes or boots secured with toggles or laces. These were practical, frequently replaced, and generally not overtly flashy, unless, of course, you were of considerable means, in which case you might commission specially made decorated versions. The Vikings didn't just wear their culture, they wore it on their heads. From intricately braided locks to perfectly sculpted beards, hair was a powerful statement of strength, identity, and, dare it be said, sex appeal. Forget the shaggy, unkempt manes so often depicted in gritty TV dramas. Real Vikings treated their hair with the reverence of armor for the face, meticulously crafted and worn with an undeniable pride. Let's delve deeper into the sacred canvas of the Norseman, the beard. Short, long, forked, braided, or meticulously squared off, a Viking's beard was his undeniable signature. It wasn't merely about the act of growing one, it was about the artistry of sculpting it. Beard oil, likely concocted from rendered animal fat infused with fragrant herbs, was diligently applied to maintain its softness and lustrous sheen. And if by some unfortunate oversight, your beard resembled something a goat had chewed on, well, you could hardly expect many invitations to the next feast. But the pride in hair was not exclusive to men. Women, too, took immense pride in their tresses, typically wearing them long and parted down the center, often intricately braided or coiled into elaborate styles for festivals and sacred rituals. On such occasions, they might adorn their hair with ribbons, beads, or even delicate bits of metal. These embellishments were not purely decorative. They served as subtle indicators of status, family ties, and on occasion even availability. Yes, Viking hair, it seems, possessed the remarkable ability to flirt before a single word was uttered. And braiding, oh, how they adored a good braid. For both genders, braids served a dual purpose, practical and aesthetic. They kept hair neatly contained during the arduous tasks of farming, the perilous voyages of sailing, or the chaotic frenzy of raiding. But they also presented an impressive visual, especially when interwoven with leather cords or threads dyed in vibrant colors. Imagine a warrior striding into battle, his beard intricately braided in the shape of ancient runes, an equal blend of intimidation and artistic expression. Some warriors, in a dramatic display of regional or tribal identity, even partially shaved their heads, leaving long hair or braids at the back, a striking look designed to leave a lasting impression on any enemy fortunate enough to survive the encounter. When it came to hair care, Vikings were not to be trifled with. They possessed a comprehensive array of tools, combs, razors, and tweezers, often carried in small pouches or suspended from their belts. Some even owned miniature mirrors, crafted from polished metal, for how else would one ensure their braid game remained impeccable after a long and arduous journey across the North Sea? Hair, for the Vikings, was more than just a style. It was an embodiment of identity, a symbol of honor, and for some, even a source of spiritual protection. Whether you were a fierce shield maiden or a skilled blacksmith, your hair told a story, and like any good saga, it was meticulously maintained. You might envision Vikings as rugged and practical, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But practicality in the Viking lexicon certainly did not equate to boring. These were people who reveled in their bling. Jewelry was not merely an adornment, it was a multifaceted entity. Currency, status symbol, cherished family heirloom, and a powerful form of personal branding, all rolled into one. A well-dressed Viking, whether embarking on a celebratory feast or a full-scale raid, simply did not leave home without a touch of glitter. Let's begin with the quintessential Viking adornments. Brooches. Viking women in particular relied heavily on these functional yet exquisite pieces, not merely to fasten their garments, but as powerful declarations of wealth and masterful craftsmanship. The iconic oval brooches, worn prominently at the shoulders, were often cast in bronze or silver, sometimes intricately inlaid with elaborate designs depicting serpents, complex knotwork, or even miniature animals. Suspended between these brooches were strands of beads, a vibrant tapestry of glass, amber, or metal charms. Think of them as wearable LinkedIn profiles broadcasting one's wealth, connections, and artistic sensibilities to the world. For men, arm rings and neck torques were the preferred modes of ostentation. These thick, robust bands of silver or bronze, often twisted and meticulously carved, were worn with immense pride. They were not simply jewelry, they were a tangible form of currency. A chieftain, in a display of generosity or strategic alliance, might reward loyalty with a gleaming silver arm ring, a piece that could, if necessary, be broken into smaller bits and weighed like coin. Indeed, Viking bling often doubled as emergency savings. Rings were also commonplace, adorning fingers and even toes. Some bore cryptic runic inscriptions, brief messages, or blessings, while others were purely for aesthetic appeal. And yes, wedding rings existed, though in true Viking fashion they tended to be chunky and symbolic rather than delicate or overtly romantic. A marriage gift might encompass a ring, a brooch, or a finely crafted pin, signaling that one was not merely marrying into a family, but possessed the necessary assets to maintain the expected standard of living. And let us not overlook the ubiquitous pendants. Thor's hammer, the Mjolnir, was a perennial favorite, worn as both a potent religious symbol and a powerful lucky charm. It was not uncommon to find intricately carved silver hammers suspended from cords of leather or woven fiber. Christian crosses, too, began to appear, particularly as more Norse folk embraced the new faith. The Vikings, ever pragmatic, were not snobs. They would often wear both, just in case one deity happened to be off duty. If your perception of makeup and skincare is limited to the elaborate rituals of medieval queens or the poetic musings of Persian bards, prepare to have that notion thoroughly challenged. Viking grooming extended far beyond the simple acts of donning clean clothes and meticulously combing one's beard. These formidable warriors, both men and women, actively engaged in what we would now categorize as personal care, incorporating fragrance and, yes, even a touch of makeup into their daily routines. Let's begin with the infamous kohl. Some historical accounts, particularly those from astute Arabic observers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan, describe Viking men meticulously lining their eyes with a dark pigment. This practice wasn't solely for the purpose of looking intimidating, though it undoubtedly contributed to their fearsome appearance. Lining the eyes also served a practical function, reducing glare from the harsh reflection of snow and sun, effectively acting as a proto-sunglass for seafarers navigating the unforgiving northern waters. Of course, it certainly didn't hurt that it also bestowed upon them the smoldering gaze of a Norse god. Practicality and fabulousness the Vikings, it seems, embraced both with equal enthusiasm. And while there was no equivalent of a modern-day Sephora in a Viking longhouse, ample archaeological evidence suggests that skincare and scents were of considerable importance. Animal fats, carefully mixed with various herbs, were transformed into balms designed to soften the skin, soothe the sting of windburn, or provide a protective barrier against the biting chill. Birch tar, primarily utilized as an adhesive or antiseptic, could also be smeared onto the skin to treat minor irritations or, with its pungent aroma, deter bothersome pests. Speaking of scents, while the Vikings may not have possessed bottled cologne in the modern sense, they possessed an innate understanding of the power of smell. Herbs such as thyme, mint, and sweet gale were frequently incorporated into their baths or placed within their clothing storage, imparting a pleasant aroma and acting as a natural insect repellent. Some wealthier individuals even carried small linen sachets filled with fragrant leaves tucked into their garments, essentially the medieval equivalent of a dryer sheet. Women, too, likely applied oils to their hair and skin, not only for their pleasing fragrance, but also to cultivate a healthy, radiant sheen. In a society where beauty and cleanliness were inextricably linked to honor and household status, a glowing complexion was not merely a matter of vanity. It was a tangible reflection of discipline and domestic skill. And let us not forget the teeth. Surprisingly, Viking skeletons often exhibit remarkably good dental health for the era. However, some individuals, in a curious display of personal expression, had decorative grooves meticulously filed into their front teeth, possibly filled with pigment or resin. Whether this was a fleeting fashion trend, a marker of tribal identity, or an early form of oral tattooing remains a subject of scholarly debate. Regardless of its precise purpose, this practice unequivocally demonstrates one thing: the Vikings were far more than mere axe-swinging brutes. They were stylish, they were scented, and they most certainly adhered to a skincare routine. Little Vikings, contrary to popular, often romanticized notions, did not run around barefoot in sackcloth, their hair a tangled nest of hay. Not at least if they wished to avoid a stern glance from their mother and quite possibly a bracing splash of icy fjord water to the face. Children in Viking society were in fact expected to be clean, presentable, and dressed in a manner that reflected both their family's means and the prevailing cultural standards of the time. In other words, even the toddlers adhered to a strict, albeit unwritten, code of style. Viking children typically wore miniature versions of adult clothing, tunics for boys, long dresses for girls, often layered with cloaks or aprons depending on the capricious whims of the weather. Wool and linen were the materials of choice, with soft leathers occasionally employed for shoes or in the colder, more unforgiving climates. And yes, these were genuine footwear, not merely scraps of hide haphazardly wrapped around their feet. Even the youngest members of the household needed to be mobile after all. One never knew when a recalcitrant goat might require chasing, or when a raiding party might unexpectedly roll through the village. Colors, too, were not limited to drab or neutral tones. Viking children, much like their adult counterparts, sported dyed fabrics in vibrant reds, earthy yellows, and deep blues, provided, of course, the family could afford them. Embroidery was also a common embellishment, particularly on garments reserved for festive occasions or ceremonial gatherings. If your child was to be presented at a thing or a family feast, you simply did not send them in rags. You meticulously braided their hair, straightened their tunic, and fervently hoped they wouldn't immediately succumb to the allure of a muddy puddle. Hair, too, was neatly managed. Little girls often wore braids, sometimes adorned with small beads, while boys might sport short, practical cuts or the nascent beginnings of the more elaborate hairstyles favored by their fathers. And hygiene, it must be emphasized, was taken with utmost seriousness. Just like adults, children were expected to wash regularly, especially before meals or any significant event. Bath Day was a communal family affair, and skipping it was simply not an option unless, of course, one wished to be branded the stinky kid at the feast. Parents, in a gesture of both practicality and tradition, often passed down grooming tools as heirlooms. A child's first comb, for instance, might be a small, intricately carved bone version of their father's, a symbolic gesture that whispered, "You are now a part of this culture. Keep your beard tidy. Someday." In many ways, Viking children were raised to embody the same core values as their parents: dignity, discipline, and an unwavering pride in their appearance. Because even at the tender age of 6, you were already an integral part of a story far grander than yourself, and you were expected to look the part. It's one thing to maintain a semblance of cleanliness when nestled beside a cozy hearth with a ready supply of hot water and a comfortable tub. It's an entirely different challenge when you're halfway across the churning sea, sleeping in the cramped confines of a longship, raiding monasteries, and quite possibly dodging a volley of arrows. Yet, remarkably, the Vikings managed to uphold their rigorous hygiene standards, even on the move, or more accurately, on the fjord. Viking warriors, far from abandoning their grooming habits at home, meticulously packed them. Archaeological discoveries from warrior graves have consistently yielded grooming kits alongside their weapons: tweezers, combs, razors, and ear picks, all neatly tucked into leather pouches or suspended from their belts. For what, after all, was the point of conquering a village if you looked as though you had just crawled out of a bog to do it? These tools were not merely decorative, they were eminently functional, durable, and an integral part of a warrior's identity. A twisted, greasy beard, for instance, could easily become an impediment during the chaos of battle. A clean-shaven neck made helmet straps considerably more comfortable, and perhaps most importantly, no one, not even a Viking, desired the incessant itch of lice. Maintaining a clean scalp and a neatly trimmed beard was a matter of comfort, pride, and frankly, health. Viking razors, simple yet remarkably sharp, were sometimes even curved, perfectly suited for a precise shave, aided by a steady hand and the fleeting reflection in a streamside pool. Even clothing, while on campaign, was diligently maintained. Vikings carried sewing needles and waxed thread, patching holes and reinforcing seams with a surprising domesticity. Looking put together wasn't about vanity, it was about utility. Torn garments had a tendency to snag in combat, loose shoes could slow you down, and wet wool was a recipe for hypothermia. So they mended, they dried, and they folded like warriors with an unexpected knack for household chores. Access to clean water sources was paramount during their travels. Vikings frequently established their camps near rivers or springs, not just for drinking, but for washing. Bathing might not have been a luxurious affair on the move, but a quick rinse with cold water was infinitely preferable to nothing at all. And when circumstances allowed, they would heat water in pots, improvising bathing stations. Not quite a spa, but a far cry from the medieval grime that most people imagine. And yes, even during rage, presentation mattered. Viking sagas often recount heroes washing their hands and combing their hair before battle or a celebratory feast. This wasn't merely poetic license, it was a reflection of their reality. Because whether you were about to swing a sword or abscond with a silver chalice, you did it with clean fingernails and a well-oiled beard. If you've been picturing Vikings as muddy, mead-sweating beasts with axes in one hand and a colony of fleas in their hair, it's time for a profound reality check. The myth of the filthy Norse brute, wild-eyed and dripping in blood and grime, was largely a construct of their enemies. And let's be honest, if you had just been raided by a stylish, muscular seafarer who also happened to smell faintly of juniper and mint, you'd probably want to make him look bad in the history books, too. The truth, as revealed by a wealth of archaeological evidence, is that the Vikings were some of the cleanest and best-groomed people in early medieval Europe. Compared to many Anglo-Saxons or Franks who viewed bathing with suspicion at best and as a sinful indulgence at worst, the Norse obsession with hygiene made them appear as walking contradictions. How? Their contemporaries must have wondered, could someone be both barbaric and better at skincare? Monks from Christian territories wrote about Norse hygiene with a peculiar blend of admiration and revulsion. They hated the fact that Viking men combed their hair, changed their shirts with infuriating regularity, and, to their utter astonishment, took weekly baths. One particularly incensed monk even whined that Norse invaders were far too successful with local women because they were always combing their hair, bathing every Saturday, and changing their clothes often. The translation is clear: they were hot. and the monks hated it. Even today, popular media often gets it wrong. Shows like Vikings or The Northman, while doing a better job than older portrayals, still tend to overplay the grit and grime. In reality, a Viking showing up to a feast in torn clothes and matted hair would be more likely to receive a side-eyed glance than a celebratory cheer. Status, honor, and reputation were everything, and that extended to how you looked and smelled. Did every Viking walk around looking like a runway model? No, of course not. Life was still harsh, and survival always took precedence. But the idea of cleanliness, order, and personal pride ran deep in their culture. A warrior's appearance was an extension of his strength, a woman's hair and dress a reflection of the honor of her household. Even in death, Vikings were buried with their combs, razors, and grooming kits because the afterlife, it was understood, deserved a polished version of you too. In most of ancient Greece, a respectable woman was expected to be quiet, hidden, and obedient, essentially invisible in public life. But step into the militaristic society of Sparta and you would encounter something radically different. Spartan women didn't just exist, they owned land, they possessed opinions, they had muscles, and quite frankly, they wielded a considerable amount of power. While Athenian women were confined to the domestic quarters, Spartan women strode confidently through the agora, managed vast estates, and engaged in verbal sparring with men in public. No one dared to tell a Spartan woman to know her place. She already knew it, right next to power. From the moment a Spartan girl was born, she was raised to be strong, outspoken, and fiercely independent. Girls received nearly the same rigorous physical training as boys, running, wrestling, and throwing javelins, not because they were expected to fight, but because it was believed that strong mothers produced strong warriors. And Sparta, a society built entirely around warfare, needed warriors like crops need rain. The next generation of soldiers, it was understood, had to come from hardy, disciplined mothers. Unlike their Athenian counterparts, Spartan women were educated. They could read, they could write, and most importantly, they could speak. Spartan women were renowned for their cutting wit and sharp tongues. Many of their stone-cold one-liners, delivered to husbands, sons, and even kings, have survived the ravages of time. One mother, handing her son his shield, famously declared, "Come back with it or on it." This was not a metaphor, it was the standard. Then there was the matter of property. In Sparta, women could inherit and own land, a radical concept in the ancient world. By some estimates, Spartan women controlled up to one-third of all property. With the men constantly away, dying gloriously in wars, it was the women who ran the economy, managed the households, and kept the Spartan machine moving. They didn't just have influence, they had agency. They chose when to marry, they negotiated dowries, and they were not confined to silence. A Spartan woman could openly challenge a decision, especially when it affected her household or her sons. If you thought arranged marriages were cold and boring, you haven't met the Spartans. In their militarized world, even romance came with a touch of strategy and a theatrical kidnapping. If you thought arranged marriages were cold and devoid of passion, you clearly haven't encountered the Spartans. In their meticulously militarized world, even the sacred act of romance was imbued with a strategic precision and a rather theatrical touch of ritualized kidnapping. Spartan marriages, far from commencing with candlelit dinners or swooning glances, began with a ritual abduction. Yes, you read that correctly. To be married in Sparta, the groom was expected to, or at least pretend to, steal his bride. But do not let the dramatic connotations of the word abduction mislead you. This was no crime. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, deeply steeped in symbolism and tradition. Here's how it unfolded. Once a marriage had been formally arranged, typically by the families involved, often with an eye towards political alliances or economic advantage, the groom, accompanied by a few trusted friends, would discreetly infiltrate the bride's household and abduct her. She was then spirited away to a secret location where an older woman, acting as a ceremonial guide, would shave her head, dress her in a man's cloak and sandals, and lay her down on a straw pallet. Now, the rationale behind this rather androgynous makeover remains a subject of scholarly debate. It likely had profound connections to Sparta's rigid gender expectations. The bride, in this symbolic act, was perhaps unsexed, a way to mark her transition from girlhood to womanhood or to subtly reflect the pervasive masculinity that Spartan society so highly prized. Shaving her head also served to inextricably link the ritual to the polis's formidable military identity. After all, while femininity was acknowledged, an unyielding toughness was deemed absolutely mandatory. The groom, having completed his part of the ritual, would then visit his new wife in secret, under the cloak of night, sometimes for months on end. By day he remained ensconced in his barracks with his fellow soldiers, adhering to the strictures of military routine. By night he would clandestinely slip away for these nocturnal trysts with his wife. It was by all accounts both profoundly romantic and at times incredibly awkward, a clandestine honeymoon that could, and often did, extend well into the first year of marriage. This peculiar custom perfectly encapsulated the delicate balancing act that Spartan society demanded, an unwavering warrior discipline above all else, yet a recognition that reproduction was an undeniable duty to the state. Men, it must be noted, were not permitted to move in with their wives until they reached the age of 30, and even then military obligations always took precedence. So you've been ritually abducted, your head has been shaved, and you are, by all official accounts, married. Congratulations. Now, pack your meager belongings and return to your parents' house, because in Sparta, being married did not, by any stretch of the imagination, mean cohabiting. In fact, one of the most astonishing aspects of Spartan marriage was the prolonged period couples spent living apart, sometimes for years. Spartan men were, by law and custom, expected to reside in military barracks until they reached the venerable age of 30. This was not an optional arrangement. From the tender age of 7, boys entered the agoge, the state-run education and training system that meticulously forged them into the formidable warriors Sparta required. Even after attaining adulthood, they remained an integral part of communal mess groups, known as syssitia, and were expected to spend their nights in the unwavering company of their fellow soldiers, not their wives. Domestic life, for the Spartan male, was always secondary to the paramount demands of duty. For newlywed men, this meant that marriage was less a shared household and more a series of recurring clandestine rendezvous. A husband would sneak away under the cloak of darkness to be with his wife, only to return to the barracks before the first blush of dawn. These nightly visits could, and often did, continue for years until the man was finally granted permission to live at home. The underlying philosophy was not to deprive them of intimacy. Rather, it was to ensure that the comforts and distractions of family life never, under any circumstances, interfered with the rigorous demands of military discipline. As for the women, they remained at home, diligently managing property, raising children, and maintaining the household. But do not imagine them pining away by the hearth, consumed by loneliness. Spartan women were famously independent and economically powerful. With their husbands away, they ran vast estates, supervised helot laborers, and actively participated in civic life. Some even amassed considerable wealth, controlling land, influencing local politics, and commanding a level of respect that was utterly unthinkable in other parts of Greece. This rather unconventional arrangement did not surprisingly hinder the Spartans from having children. In fact, producing strong offspring was considered a fundamental civic duty. Some historical sources even suggest that if a man was deemed too weak or infertile, another, more robust Spartan male could be invited to father children with his wife, all with the explicit blessing of the state. The ultimate goal was not romantic love or personal fulfillment. It was the unwavering survival and absolute supremacy of Sparta. In Sparta, motherhood was not a gentle, nurturing affair. It was a profound civic mission. Spartan women were not lauded for their embroidery skills or their piety. They were celebrated, above all else, for their ability to produce strong sons who would serve the state. Giving birth was not merely a personal event, it was an act of profound patriotism. Every child born was a potential future warrior, the mother of one, and the stakes in this militarized society were astronomically high. From a tender age, girls were rigorously trained for this pivotal role, not only in the domestic arts, but crucially physically. Running, wrestling, discus, throwing, all these exercises were not simply for sport. They were meticulously designed to ensure the development of healthy, capable mothers who possessed the physical fortitude to bear robust children. A weak mother, the Spartans firmly believed, would inevitably bear weak soldiers, and Sparta, in its relentless pursuit of strength, had no room for such perceived frailty. When a Spartan woman gave birth, her child was immediately subjected to a rigorous examination by the state. If the newborn appeared frail or deformed, it could be, and often was, abandoned, left at the foot of Mount Taegetus, exposed to the unforgiving elements. As brutal and seemingly heartless as this practice sounds to modern sensibilities, it was a stark reflection of the Spartan obsession with strength and survival. There was no tolerance for perceived weakness, only the strong would be raised, meticulously trained, and eventually contribute to the formidable warrior machine. But for women who did produce healthy, vigorous sons, their status within society was immeasurably elevated. Spartan mothers wielded immense influence, not through direct political power, but through the enduring legacy of their offspring. A woman who had tragically lost multiple sons in battle might receive public honors. She was not pitied but revered, her sacrifice seen as noble, almost sacred. Mothers would famously tell their sons to return with your shield or on it, a stark directive meaning to come back victorious or die trying. Interestingly, Spartan women were not merely seen as baby factories. They possessed a significant say in their children's upbringing, particularly before the boys were handed over to the agoge at the age of 7. Until that pivotal moment, mothers were the primary shapers of their children's values, instilling in them the core Spartan virtues of pride, endurance, and discipline. Girls, meanwhile, remained under their mother's tutelage, meticulously molded into the next generation of Spartan women, strong, intelligent, and unafraid to speak their minds. Lineage, too, played a significant role. Noble Spartan women hailed from the warrior elite, and their family connections could profoundly impact marriage prospects and land inheritance. But regardless of social class, a mother's greatest pride and the ultimate mark of honor was in raising a child who could serve the state with unwavering loyalty and strength. While women across much of the ancient world were treated as little more than chattel, Spartan women, in a radical departure from the norm, owned property and a considerable amount of it. Indeed, by some scholarly estimates, they controlled nearly a third of all land in Sparta. This was not merely a historical footnote, it represented a seismic shift in gender norms. In a society where men were perpetually absent, engaged in training or warfare, women stepped into the economic driver's seat and, crucially, never relinquished control. This wasn't some accidental loophole in the legal system. Spartan law explicitly permitted women to inherit property from both their fathers and their husbands, and given the grim reality that so many Spartan men died young in battle, widows were a common demographic and often quite wealthy. But these women were not passive landholders, content to merely collect rents. They actively managed their estates, directed the labor of helots, and engaged in complex business dealings. They were landowners, estate managers, and economic power brokers, all rolled into one formidable package. This unique position rendered Spartan women extraordinarily influential. They possessed wealth, they wielded authority, and they enjoyed a level of autonomy that was virtually unheard of elsewhere. They did not require male guardians to represent them in court or in public dealings, as Athenian women did. A Spartan woman could act in her own name, a rare and precious privilege in the ancient world, but with all that power came a degree of suspicion, particularly from outside observers. Non-Spartan writers, such as the renowned philosopher Aristotle, complained bitterly about the extensive control Spartan women exercised. He, in his rather biased view, blamed them for the perceived decline of Sparta, labeling them as unruly, indulgent, and far too influential for their own good. In truth, he was likely deeply uncomfortable with the revolutionary idea of women being more economically independent than the average Athenian male. Within Sparta itself, however, This arrangement made perfect sense. Men were warriors. Their lives were dedicated to the state. If they were to be absent from home for the majority of their lives, someone had to keep the economy running, the households functioning, and the agricultural output flowing. That someone unequivocally was the Spartan woman. It wasn't feminism in the modern sense, it was a pragmatic function. But the result was the same. Women who were educated, empowered, and economically self-sufficient. They didn't just marry warriors, they bankrolled them. In a culture so utterly obsessed with discipline and the brutal realities of warfare, one might naturally assume that beauty and fashion would be relegated to mere afterthoughts. But Spartan women were not merely strong, they were strikingly beautiful. And unlike their Athenian counterparts, who were often veiled and cloistered indoors, Spartan women walked boldly in public, unashamed of their bodies, their opinions, or their commanding presence. In Sparta, beauty was not about softness or delicate fragility. It was about an undeniable strength, a vibrant health, and an unyielding pride. Spartan standards of beauty were, in themselves, unique. Pale skin and a delicate frailty, the hallmarks of aristocratic women in other Greek cities, were not desirable here. A sun-kissed tan meant you trained outdoors, a testament to your physical prowess. Well-defined muscles signified your ability to run, wrestle, and crucially, bear strong children. Spartan women were admired not just for their physical attractiveness, but for the profound power that their appearance represented. They did not strive for a fragile delicacy. They radiated an almost primal vitality. Their clothing, too, reflected this pragmatic attitude. While women in Athens were often wrapped in layers of restrictive fabric designed to ensure modesty and immobility, Spartan women wore the peplos, a simpler, more functional garment. But the Spartan peplos was often shorter, even slid up the side, allowing for an unparalleled freedom of movement. This predictably shocked the rest of Greece. To them, Spartan women appeared scandalously underdressed, but to the Spartans, this practicality was simply common sense. Hair was typically worn long and loose, symbolizing freedom and maturity. There is no substantial evidence of elaborate cosmetics routines. Spartan women were not painting their faces to please men. Beauty, for them, emanated from fitness, cleanliness, and an innate confidence. It was a physical extension of their inner discipline, and they were not confined to the shadows. Spartan women were a visible presence at festivals, athletic competitions, and religious ceremonies. They sang in choruses, danced in public, and even competed in their own games. This level of public visibility was utterly unheard of elsewhere in Greece. In Athens, a woman's honor was inextricably tied to how rarely she was seen or heard. In Sparta, a woman's reputation began with her public voice. This open, unapologetic presence unnerved many Greek observers. They saw brazen boldness where Sparta saw an admirable virtue. They perceived shamelessness where Sparta saw an unyielding pride. But the truth was simple. Spartan women were not ornamental. They were active, vital citizens, commanding attention not through superficial makeup or glittering jewelry, but through the sheer force of their presence, their undeniable strength, and the unapologetic confidence of someone raised to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected. If your imagination conjures ancient women as quiet, demure, and sweetly spoken, Spartan women will, with a single cutting remark, shatter that delicate fantasy. These women were not only educated, they were famously, unapologetically outspoken. In a world where the vast majority of women were silenced by custom or by law, Spartan women were actively encouraged to speak their minds, and when they spoke, they did not whisper, they roared. Unlike their Athenian counterparts, who were typically uneducated and confined to the domestic sphere, Spartan girls were rigorously schooled in both mind and body. Literacy was common, and they learned poetry, music, dance, and perhaps most crucially, the intricate art of rhetoric. In a society where verbal sparring was almost as highly regarded as physical combat, Spartan women held their own and more often than not delivered the decisive blow. Uh, Historical sources are replete with quotes attributed to Spartan women that even today land like verbal daggers. When a mother was informed that her son had died bravely in battle, her response was chillingly pragmatic. I bore him for that very purpose. Another, upon learning that her son had allegedly fled from battle, famously retorted, "Why do you still live? Brutal?" Absolutely. But these were not heartless women. They were simply steeped in a culture where unwavering loyalty to the state superseded any personal emotion. Their sharp wit and unyielding resolve were not reserved solely for their children. Spartan women routinely mocked cowardice in men, even their own husbands, and conversely lavished praise upon valor. A woman might suffer immense social ostracism if her son or husband displayed weakness in battle. Conversely, if they died gloriously, she was honored, almost sacred. In Sparta, strength of character and a formidable tongue were considered feminine virtues. This formidable reputation spread far beyond the borders of Laconia. Greek writers from other city-states frequently commented on the perceived unfeminine nature of Spartan women, their bold voices, their prominent public presence, their steadfast refusal to be subdued. But Sparta, in its singular focus, cared little for Athenian opinions. It cared about results. And a woman who possessed the ability to command attention, to raise formidable warriors, and to speak with the authority of a general, one to be respected. Even in myth and memory, Spartan women stand out not for their passivity, but for their powerful presence. They were not merely mothers and wives. They were mentors, guardians of discipline, and verbal gladiators in a city built upon the very foundation of strength. In Sparta, silence was not golden, it was suspicious. And a Spartan woman armed with a sharp tongue that was just another potent weapon in the arsenal. In most of ancient Greece, marital fidelity was a decidedly one-way street. Men were afforded the liberty to stray, while women were rigidly confined to strict monogamy. But in Sparta, even the intricate dance of sexual politics was infused with an unconventional pragmatism. Spartan marriage did not revolve around the tender sentiments of romantic love or the rigid confines of monogamy. Instead, it was a starkly utilitarian institution, centered on biology, civic duty, and the unwavering imperative of ensuring a steady, robust stream of future warriors. And sometimes this meant bending or even outright breaking the typical rules of fidelity. Spartan society was at its core deeply pragmatic. The very survival of the state hinged upon the strength of its army, and a formidable army in turn demanded strong, healthy children. Consequently, if a husband was deemed too old, too weak, or too frequently absent on campaign, it was not unthinkable for a Spartan wife to be temporarily, or even semi-officially, paired with another man purely for reproductive purposes. This was not considered scandalous. It was, in essence, statecraft. Historical accounts detail instances of older men with the state's blessing lending their wives to younger, fitter men to produce healthy offspring. Sometimes explicit permission was granted. At other times, such arrangements were made quietly through unspoken understanding. And if a woman herself identified a strong, reputable Spartan and wished to bear his children, she could do so, provided she had her husband's blessing. The paramount factor in these arrangements was not jealousy or conventional morality. It was the unwavering focus on strength, lineage, and above all, civic benefit. This unique approach has understandably fueled debates among historians regarding whether Sparta practiced a form of polyandry, one woman having multiple husbands, particularly given that male citizens were often away for years on military campaigns. While it was not an official codified policy, practical arrangements such as shared wives or fathering agreements undoubtedly existed. However, it is crucial to emphasize that these arrangements were not born of love triangles or a philosophy of free love. They were meticulously designed to breed the best possible soldiers. And children born of these unions were considered fully legitimate, provided both biological parents were citizens. The state, in its relentless pursuit of military excellence, was not concerned with whose name appeared on a birth record. It cared only about the quality of the next hoplite. Uh, of course, this reproductive flexibility was not universally available. It was strictly limited to full Spartan citizens, the elite Spartiates, whose declining numbers made each birth a matter of national interest and strategic importance. The helots and lower classes were not afforded the same agency or choices. Nevertheless, this unique approach granted Spartan women a level of sexual autonomy virtually unseen elsewhere in the Greek world. While Athenian women were cloistered and guarded to preserve their chastity, Spartan women were trusted and even expected to make decisions about reproduction that aligned directly with the needs of the state. In Sparta, your love life was not merely personal, it was profoundly political. And babies, they were not just blessings, they were strategic assets. Long after the glory of Sparta had faded into the annals of history, the legend of the Spartan woman endured, fierce, independent, and utterly unlike any other woman in the ancient world. While Athenian playwrights and Roman historians often reduced her to a mere curiosity or a cautionary tale, her legacy was far grander than any scandal or stereotype could encompass. She embodied a rare and potent combination of discipline, authority, and an unyielding self-respect, qualities that have resonated through time like the sharp clang of a spear striking bronze. In her own era, the Spartan woman was a walking contradiction. She was a landowner in a patriarchal world, a public speaker in a society that actively sought to silence women, a figure of beauty whose body was admired not for its delicate softness but for its formidable strength. She did not hide behind a veil, nor did she passively await instruction. She instructed. She ran vast estates, raised formidable warriors, offered cutting political observations, and even, in her unique way, directed reproductive decisions, all while operating within one of the most rigidly militarized societies ever known. She was not a feminist in the modern sense. Her freedoms were undeniably granted by a brutal system built around male warfare. Yet, within those very constraints, she achieved a level of autonomy that other Greek women could only dream of, and she did so without apology. Her profound influence was not confined to her lifetime. Philosophers like Aristotle, despite their criticisms, found themselves compelled to write about her. Roman writers, captivated by her boldness, could not cease discussing her. Even modern historians remain enthralled by her paradox. Empowered, yet born into a system that prioritized the state above the individual self. And yet, that is precisely what makes her so compelling. The Spartan woman was never merely a side character in her husband's narrative. She was the very foundation of Spartan society. She was the unwavering force who kept the economy running, the households intact, and the vital supply of warriors steady. She was the unsung strategist behind the spear wielders, the unyielding shield that remarkably did not crack. In many profound ways, she challenges every preconceived assumption about gender roles in the ancient world. While most women were systematically denied agency, the Spartan woman embodied it. And while her freedoms were, in essence, carved from necessity, they evolved into cultural cornerstones, respected, institutionalized, and for some even feared. Today, she remains a potent symbol of contradiction and defiance, not because she rejected her society's values, but because she mastered them. In a world dominated by men, she didn't just survive, she thrived, armed with a mind as sharp as any blade, a meticulously run estate, and a tongue that could wound far deeper than any sword. In Sparta, death was not viewed as a tragedy. It was instead a profound test, a final, ultimate measure of whether an individual had truly lived in unwavering service to the state. Unlike the often lavish and emotionally charged funerary customs of Athens or Egypt, Spartan death rites were stripped bare of overt emotion and elaborate ornament. There was no prolonged public mourning, no ornate grave markers for the masses. In fact, the vast majority of Spartans were buried anonymously. A nameless grave was not considered shameful. It was rather the expected norm. Only two distinct types of individuals were granted the singular honor of having their names meticulously carved in stone: warriors who had fallen valiantly in battle, and women who had tragically died in childbirth. Everyone else, regardless of their standing or respect in life, was interred quietly without any public commemoration. Why? Because in the unyielding eyes of Sparta, the ultimate sacrifice was not merely living well, it was dying for the state. For men, this meant a death on the battlefield, not from illness, not in old age, and most certainly not peacefully in bed. A warrior who met his end clutching his shield, maintaining his formation, was a hero. A man who, by some unfortunate accident, slipped in the bath and died was, in the grand scheme of Spartan memory, forgotten. Spartans held the unwavering belief that falling in battle was the only truly noble end, the ultimate culmination of a life meticulously shaped by the brutal agoge training and years of relentless military service. It was, in essence, an honorable discharge, with no return ticket. For women, the battlefield was different, yet equally perilous. The birthing room. If a woman tragically died while giving birth, she was seen as having fulfilled her highest and most sacred duty, that of producing the next generation of formidable warriors. Like the male soldier, she had faced immense pain and inherent risk for the sake of Sparta's very survival. Her death, too, merited a grave marked by her name. Everyone else, the merchants, the elders, the craftspeople, even those who lived long, peaceful lives and died of natural causes, received a modest burial, their graves left unmarked. Their service to the state was undoubtedly appreciated, but it was not glorified. The logic, though brutal, was undeniably consistent. Sparta honored sacrifice, not sentiment. Mourning periods were kept deliberately brief, typically lasting only a few days, and loud lamentation was actively discouraged. The focus was not on overwhelming sorrow, but on the enduring legacy of the deceased. How did the person die? What did their death contribute to the unwavering strength of Sparta? In this harsh, unyielding system, dying well was not about comfort or personal peace. It was about proving your inherent worth one final time in the most definitive and public way possible.